Every man in Coldwater Creek knew that Wallace Wallace would be gone before the last song ended, and yet on the night of the harvest gathering of 1882, he stayed until the lanterns burned low, and nobody could quite explain why, except for the woman who arrived when the moon was already high. Coldwater Creek sat in the high desert country of New Mexico Territory, a town that had clawed itself out of red clay and stubbornness sometime around 1874. It was not a beautiful place in the way that paintings describe the West. It was dry and loud and smelled of horse and sawdust, and the particular metallic tang of well water drawn up through iron pipes. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without incident, lined with a general store, a telegraph office, a livery, 2 saloons of varying reputation, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the doctor's office, which Dr. Emmett Prout ran from a converted stable with considerably more skill than the building deserved. Beyond the main street, small homes spread outward in no particular order, as if the town itself had simply grown the way a weed grows, wherever there was space and whatever little water there happened to be. Wallace Wallace, and yes, that was truly his name, and yes, he had heard every possible joke a man could make about it, and no, none of those jokes had ever made him so much as smile, was 31 years old in the autumn of 1882. He worked a medium-sized cattle ranch about 4 miles outside of town. It was not a grand operation. He had 1,200 acres, a solid herd of around 200 head of longhorn, a foreman named Chet Aldridge who was 60 years old and built like a fence post, and 2 hired hands who did their work without complaint. The ranch had belonged to Wallace's father before him, and to his father's business partner before that, and it bore no name, which bothered people who felt that a thing ought to have a name. Wallace did not feel that way. The land was the land. He knew every stone of it. What Wallace Wallace was known for, more than any particular skill with cattle or any act of notable courage or any story that got told loudly over whiskey, was leaving. He left early from everything. Barn dances, town meetings, Sunday suppers, 4th of July celebration, christenings, harvest gatherings, funerals, card games. He would appear, and his appearance alone was enough to mark an event as something attended by real people, because Wallace Wallace was not a man who attended things out of obligation, which meant that when he did appear, it meant something. And then, usually within the hour, he would finish whatever drink was in his hand, place it with careful deliberateness on whatever surface was nearest, pull his hat down in what had become recognizable as his specific farewell gesture, and walk out into the night without ceremony or excuse. People had stopped asking why. He went when he went. That was Wallace. The truth, which Wallace had never spoken aloud to another living person, was that gatherings made him lonely in a way that solitude never did. Being alone on his land, riding the fence line at dusk with the sky turning the color of old copper, he felt entirely himself, entirely sufficient, entirely at peace. But in a room full of people laughing and dancing and talking, he felt the absence of something so acutely that it became almost physical, like a bruised rib, noticeable with every breath. He had long since decided that this absence was simply the nature of a man like him, and that the practical remedy was to limit his exposure to such rooms. The harvest gathering of 1882 was held in the livery, which had been swept out and decorated with dried corn husks, and the last of the season's wildflowers by the women of the Methodist Ladies' Auxiliary, who took such matters seriously. It was the 3rd week of October. The nights had begun to cool in that particular way that meant summer was not coming back, that clean bite of cold that smelled like pine resin and distance. Fiddler Pete Dunlap, who was 70 years old and played with the authority of a man who has been making music since before the audience was born, set up in the corner with his usual accompanist, a young man named Thomas who played the guitar with more enthusiasm than precision. The livery smelled, despite all cleaning efforts, still faintly of horse. Wallace arrived at 7 o'clock, which was late enough to be polite and early enough to leave by 8 without seeming rude. He shook 3 hands in the first 5 minutes, declined a second whiskey from Roy Garland, who pressed drinks on people the way a salesman pressed pamphlets, found a position near the wall where he could observe without being observed too directly, and settled into the quiet calculation of how soon he could reasonably go. He talked with Chet's wife, Martha, about the state of her vegetable garden and the particularly stubborn deer that had been raiding it. He talked briefly with the sheriff, a capable man named Franklin Cole, about whether the road between Coldwater Creek and the neighboring town of Myra Pass needed attention before winter made it impassable. He watched Pete Dunlap and Thomas start up a reel that got 6 or 7 couples onto the cleared floor with a sound like shuffled cards and happy noise. He checked the position of the moon through the livery's wide-open doors. It was not yet 9 o'clock, but the gathering was in full swing, which meant he could leave without leaving a gap. He was reaching for his hat when Chet Aldridge materialized beside him the way old men sometimes do, silently and with intent. "You are not leaving," Chet said. It was not a question. "I was thinking about it," Wallace said. "Sit with me a minute," Chet said. "My feet hurt and Martha won't let me rest them near the wall because she says it looks antisocial. You standing here makes me look sociable by comparison." Wallace almost smiled. "You are the most antisocial man I employ. And I work for a man who leaves every social gathering before the first hour is done, so that tells you something about the hiring standards." Wallace stayed. He stayed partly because he genuinely liked Chet in the way you like a man who has told you the truth about a difficult thing more than once and been right every time, and partly because leaving now would have felt, suddenly and inexplicably, like admitting something. He was not sure what. It was nearly 9:30 when the livery doors, already open to the cool night, framed a new arrival. She came in without fanfare, without announcement, without apology for the lateness of the hour, wearing a dark green dress that was not particularly fashionable but was well-made and clean, her hair put up with the particular efficiency of a woman who has done her own hair her whole life without anyone to help her. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with a face that was not classically pretty in the way that women in catalogs were pretty, but was entirely interesting, with dark eyes that moved across the room the way a person's eyes move when they are genuinely curious about what they are seeing rather than merely performing interest. She carried a covered dish in both hands, which she brought directly to the table near the far wall where the food had been arranged, setting it down with the focused care of someone who had been carrying something for a distance. Wallace had not moved. His hat was in his hand, and he had not put it on. He was watching her, and he was not the only one. Several people near the door turned to look, the way people in small towns always look at the unfamiliar, with that mixture of welcome and assessment that is unique to communities where the unfamiliar is rare. "Who is that?" he asked Chet, which was itself unusual because Wallace Wallace rarely asked questions about other people. Chet craned his neck with the slow authority of a man whose age gives him the right to stare without shame. "That," he said, "is Lydia Vaughn. She has been in town about 6 weeks. She is living in the old Morrison place near the creek. Came from somewhere in Texas, I believe. She has the schoolteacher position. Miss Adelaide retired, if you recall." Wallace recalled Miss Adelaide, who had been 72 years old and had taught the children of Coldwater Creek their letters and arithmetic with the grim efficiency of a woman who considers education a moral obligation rather than a pleasure. He had not heard that she was being replaced. "She teaches school," he said. "She teaches school," Chet confirmed. "She came alone, which half the town thinks is respectable and the other half thinks is suspicious. Martha says she is very capable. Apparently she keeps a very orderly classroom." Lydia Vaughn, across the room, had straightened up from her dish and was now being welcomed by Florence Garland, Roy's wife, who was the town's unofficial ambassador to all newcomers, a role she occupied with genuine warmth and only occasional nosiness. Lydia was smiling at something Florence said, and the smile changed her face in a way that Wallace noticed from across a livery full of people and music and lantern smoke. He did not go. He stayed as Pete Dunlap launched into a slower tune, something with a minor key that made the dancing more deliberate. He stayed as the night deepened, and the candles in the lanterns burned lower, and several of the older couples departed, and the crowd thinned to the people who genuinely wanted to be there rather than those who had come out of obligation. He watched Lydia Vaughn talk to Florence, then to the minister's wife, then to young Thomas the guitar player between songs, then to Dr. Prout, who was a widower and a good man, and who appeared to be in the middle of explaining something about the territory's history that Lydia appeared to be genuinely interested in. He did not cross the room. He was not the kind of man who crossed rooms for purposes of introduction. He had the social confidence of a man who does not need things from other people, which sometimes looks like arrogance and is actually something else entirely. It was Martha Aldridge who resolved the situation, as Martha Aldridge resolved most situations in Coldwater Creek, with a particular cheerful directness that made it impossible to object. "Wallace," she said, materializing at his elbow in much the same way her husband had earlier, "come and meet Miss Vaughn. She has not yet met many of the ranchers, and I told her you were the one worth knowing." "You told her no such thing," Wallace said. "I told her you were reliable and not a drinker, and that your land borders the creek, which gives you both something to discuss since she walks along that creek every morning apparently, and I may have mentioned other things. Come along." There was no graceful way to resist Martha Aldridge in full motion, and Wallace, despite everything, did not entirely want to. He followed her across the cleared dance floor, past Pete Dunlap, who was on a break and wiping his face with a cloth, to the edge of the room where Lydia Vaughn had found a position, and this made him notice her all over again, near the wall, where she could observe without being observed too directly. They were introduced. Lydia Vaughn looked at him with those dark, genuinely curious eyes and said, "Wallace Wallace, that is a name I would not forget." "It has that quality," he agreed. "Were your parents making a point, or was it accidental?" "My father's name was Wallace, and my mother thought it was a strong name and did not consider the consequence of combining it with the family name, which was also Wallace. That is either the most confident naming decision or the least considered one in the history of New Mexico territory. Those are not mutually exclusive possibilities," he said. She looked at him with a particular attention that he was not used to, and he felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that she was actually listening to him rather than waiting for her turn to speak. In his experience, most people at gatherings were waiting for their turn to speak. He himself was usually one of them. At this moment, he was not. Martha Aldridge, having achieved her purpose with the speed and precision of a woman who is very good at her work, excused herself to attend to something elsewhere. "Martha tells me your land borders Coldwater Creek," Lydia said. "The eastern portion of it, about a mile of creek frontage. I walk the creek in the mornings. There is a place where it bends around a stand of cottonwoods, and in the early light, the way the water catches it, I walk down there most days before school." "I know the bend," Wallace said. "There is a beaver dam about 30 yards upstream from it, has been there longer than I have owned the land. I have seen it. The beavers are very committed. They are the most industrious things in the territory." She smiled again, and again it changed something. "What time do you ride your fence line?" "I want to make sure I am not trespassing. You are not on my land at that bend. The property line is 20 yards east of the cottonwoods." "Good," she said simply, and she said it in a way that meant she would keep walking there regardless, and that she was informing him of this fact rather than asking permission, and that she found the property line genuinely useful information and not a prohibition. They talked until Pete Dunlap started playing again. They talked about the creek and about the territory and about whether the winter would be hard. The signs suggested it would. The woolly caterpillars were very dark that year, which old ranching wisdom claimed meant a difficult season, and Lydia said she had heard the same thing from her grandmother in Texas, who was the most reliable weather predictor she had ever known. They talked about the school and about the children, 3 of whom were related to Wallace's hired hands, and about how the classroom needed a new window on the south side, because the light in the afternoon was impossible, which was something Wallace filed away in the back of his mind without entirely meaning to. They talked about books. She had an opinion about books that he found immediately interesting, which was that a book should tell you something true about a person or a place or a time that you could not have known otherwise, and that any book that failed this test was just noise. He had never had that conversation with anyone in Coldwater Creek. He had barely had that conversation with himself. When the gathering finally concluded, when the last lanterns were trimmed and Pete Dunlap folded his fiddle into its case, and the couples and families moved out into the cool October night in clusters of warmth and noise, Wallace walked Lydia Vaughn to the edge of the livery, because it seemed like the thing to do, and she did not tell him otherwise. "You are known for leaving early," she said. She said it without accusation or coyness, just as a fact she had been given. "Martha mentioned it. Martha mentions a great many things. She said you are always the first to leave every gathering. She said everyone in town knows it." "That is accurate," he said. Lydia looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "You did not go tonight?" "No," he said. She considered this for a moment with the same genuine, unsentimental attention she had given everything else he had said that evening. "Good night, Wallace Wallace," she said, and she walked in the direction of the old Morrison place with the easy confidence of a woman who walks alone at night without fear, because she is not the kind of person fear finds useful. He stood at the edge of the livery in the cool October dark and watched her go, and felt something settle in his chest like a stone, finding the bottom of a creek, solid and certain and quiet. He did not have a word for it yet, but it was there. The following Monday morning, Wallace rode the fence line on the eastern portion of his property the way he did every Monday morning, checking for breaks and for any signs of the gray wolves that had been spotted twice in the previous month and were likely moving south ahead of the weather. It was early, not yet 7, the sky still doing that particular thing where the color has not quite committed to blue yet, but the darkness is gone, everything in a state of becoming. He came around the bend in the fence line that brought him closest to the creek, and he could see, from the rise of the land, the cottonwood grove below. And there she was. Lydia Vaughn was standing at the edge of the water in the early light, not doing anything in particular, not washing, not working, just standing there with her face turned slightly upstream where the beaver dam was, watching the water. She was wearing a plain coat over what looked like her everyday dress, her hair braided rather than pinned, and she looked like a person who is entirely alone and entirely comfortable with it, which was a thing Wallace recognized because he felt it himself every morning on the fence line. He did not call out. He did not ride down. He sat on his horse at the top of the rise for a long moment, watching her not because it was his business to watch her, but because there was something in the particular quality of her stillness that was peaceful to observe, the way the water itself was peaceful to watch. Then he turned the horse back to the fence line and continued his work. He found the broken fence post he had been expecting on the northern quarter and spent 40 minutes fixing it. By the time he rode back past the rise, the cottonwood grove was empty. Lydia Vaughn had gone to teach school. He rode home with the sun fully up now, and the sky committed to a clear and honest blue, and the stone in his chest from Saturday night was still there, still settled, still certain. He thought about the south window in the schoolhouse. He thought about the fact that he had several good boards in his lumber shed that he had bought earlier in the year for a project he had not yet started. He thought about these things in the particular way a practical man thinks about practical things, which looks from the outside like planning, but is actually, underneath, something considerably more. On Wednesday afternoon, he drove his wagon into town to see Roy Garland about an order of wire, and while he was there, he stopped by the schoolhouse. It was after 3, after the children had been dismissed, and the schoolhouse was quiet in the way that places built for children are quiet when the children are gone, a particular expectant silence, as if the room is simply resting before the noise begins again. The door was open. He knocked on the frame. Lydia Vaughn was at the front of the room, erasing the afternoon's work from the large chalkboard. She was in her teacher's clothes, which were neat and practical, with chalk dust on her right sleeve. She turned when he knocked, and the directness with which she turned, no hesitation, no performance of surprise, was consistent with everything else he had observed about her. "Wallace Wallace," she said. "I heard from Chet's wife that the south window is a problem," he said. "I have lumber. I can replace the frame and put in a better window before the cold comes in if the Board of Education agrees to the glass." She set down her eraser and looked at him with that steady, genuinely attending quality. "Why would you do that?" "Because it needs doing." She waited. He was beginning to understand, someone who waited for the complete truth rather than the quick answer. He respected this. He also found it slightly alarming in the way that things which require more honesty than you are used to giving are slightly alarming. "And because you said the light in the afternoon is impossible," he added. "For the students," she said. "For the students," he agreed. And then, because she was still waiting, he said, "And because you mentioned it, which I remembered." She looked at him for another moment. "When can you start?" "Saturday, if the board approves it." "I will speak to Reverend Dawes tomorrow. He chairs the board." He nodded. He picked up his hat, which he had held in his hands throughout this conversation in a way he had not entirely noticed until now. "I will check back Friday. You could come to supper Thursday evening and I could tell you the answer then," she said. She said it with the same calm directness as everything else, not as an invitation wrapped in uncertainty, but as a practical proposal between sensible adults. Florence Garland's recipe for venison stew requires feeding at least 2 people or the proportions do not work out correctly. "That is not how proportions work," he said. "No," she agreed, perfectly seriously. "But I have made the same mistake twice now, and I would rather have company." He came to supper Thursday evening, arriving at the old Morrison place, which Lydia had made considerably more livable in 6 weeks, with clean curtains and a kitchen that smelled of the aforementioned stew, at 6 o'clock. The house was modest, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft, with a porch that faced west and caught the last of the evening light. She had books on a shelf she had made herself from 2 boards and a pair of crates, and the shelf was full, which told him something. She had a small writing desk in the corner with papers stacked neatly, and an ink bottle with a good brass lid. Reverend Dawes had approved the window project without hesitation. She told him over supper, and had in fact mentioned several other repairs the school needed and asked if Wallace might consider a full day of work. Lydia said she had told the Reverend that she could only speak for the window, not for Wallace's schedule. "That was the right answer," Wallace said. "I thought so. I do not make promises for other people." "Neither do I." They ate and they talked, and the talking was easy in a way that talking at gatherings never was for Wallace. Easy in the way that work was easy when you were good at it. A natural expenditure of energy toward a worthwhile thing. She told him about Texas, about the town she had come from, which was smaller than Coldwater Creek and considerably less interesting, and about the school there where she had first taught, and about why she had left. "There was a man," she said, not dramatically, just as information. "He had decided we were going to be married. He had told other people this before he had told me. I found it out from 3 separate sources before he told me himself. By then I had decided I was not interested in marrying a man who makes decisions about my life and informs me of them afterward." "He sounds like a fool," Wallace said. He was not a fool exactly. He was a man who had learned that the world would arrange itself around his preferences if he expected it to, which is a different thing. She looked at him with those direct eyes across the supper table. "Most men here are curious about why a woman my age has come to New Mexico territory alone. They ask it with varying degrees of delicacy. You have not asked. I assumed you would tell me if you wanted to." I did want to. I just wanted to decide when. She picked up her coffee cup. What about you? What about me? You are 31 and you live alone on a ranch 4 miles out of town, and you leave every gathering before anyone has said anything worth leaving for. Why? I told you already. Gatherings make me. He paused. He was not a man who complained about his own interior life. He had always found the practice somewhat indulgent. Make you what? She was not pushing. She was asking with that genuine attention that made honest answers seem like the natural thing, the path of least resistance. Aware of something missing, he said. Not in a way I can do anything about at a gathering. The gathering is not the solution to the problem. What is the problem? He looked at the coffee in his own cup for a moment. I do not know yet, he said. She did not push further. She simply nodded as if she had heard something that made a kind of sense to her and passed him the bread. He left at 8:30, which was a reasonable time and was not early. On the porch, before he went to his horse, he turned to her and said, "Thank you for supper." "Thank you for the window," she said. "I have not done it yet." "No, but you will." He rode home in the dark with the cottonwood trees along the creek making their particular dry autumn sound in the wind, and the stone in his chest had moved. It had not gone. It had simply shifted, become warmer, become more specific. He recognized it now, the way you recognize a landmark on a road you have been riding and not quite admitted you were on. He was in serious trouble, and the trouble had dark eyes and a shelf full of books, and could tell the difference between a fool and a man who had simply been undone by the world's willingness to accommodate him. He built the window on Saturday. He arrived early with his tools and his lumber in the wagon, and Lydia was there with coffee and the practical efficiency of a woman who did not fuss about things that were being handled. She moved her students' belongings away from the south wall without being asked and without making a ceremony of it, and then she left him to his work because she had papers to mark. She sat at her desk at the front of the room and marked papers while he worked on the window, and the sound of the schoolroom pencil on paper, occasional footsteps as she moved between the desk and the shelf, the particular silence of a person concentrating, was a sound that settled around Wallace the way good work settles around a man who is doing something useful. At mid-morning, she brought him a second cup of coffee and looked at the window frame and said it was very well done. The sash will be ready from Jensen's glass shop in Myra Pass by the end of the month, he said. I will put it in when it arrives. Thank you, she said. And then, because she was Lydia, you are very good at this. I have been fixing things on my property for 9 years. I do not mean the carpentry, she said, and went back to her desk. He spent the next quarter of an hour thinking about what she meant, and then he was fairly certain he knew, and the certainty was both the most comfortable and the most unsettling feeling he had experienced in years. November came to Coldwater Creek with the seriousness of a season that means business. The first hard frost appeared on the 2nd of the month, turning the grass silver by morning. The creek ran lower and colder. The cattle on Wallace's ranch were moved to the winter pasture, and the work of the season changed from the sprawling, riding work of summer to the more concentrated, close-in work of cold months, mending equipment, laying in feed, keeping the water troughs from freezing. Wallace worked hard, and he thought about Lydia Vaughn. He called at the Morrison place on the Thursday evenings that had begun, by mutual unspoken agreement, to be their evenings. They cooked together. She taught him her grandmother's cornbread recipe in exchange for his knowledge of how to properly prepare a venison roast, and they talked. She told him about growing up in Texas with a father who ran a small hardware store and a mother who had been a schoolteacher herself before marriage took her out of the classroom, which she had always privately resented. He told her about growing up on this land, about his father's methodical, undemonstrative love for the territory, about the year he was 12 when a drought took half the herd and his father had simply gotten up the next morning and started over without a word of complaint, which had taught him something about how a man ought to be. Your father sounds like someone worth knowing, Lydia said. He died in 1876, a horse accident. He was not old. I am sorry. "He did good work while he was here," Wallace said. "That seems like the important thing." She looked at him. "Do you actually believe that, or is that what you say?" He thought about it honestly, because with Lydia there was no point in anything else. "Both," he said finally. "It is true, and it is also what I say, and it is easier to say it than to say the other thing. The other thing being that you miss him." "Yes. You are allowed to miss him and believe he did good work," she said, with a particular matter-of-fact gentleness that was entirely her own. "Those are not competing facts." He looked at her across the small kitchen table with the lamp between them and the cold November wind moving against the windows, and he thought that she was the most honest person he had ever sat across a table from, and that this quality in her was like the quality of the creek at the beaver dam in early morning light, clear and quiet and utterly itself, and beautiful in a way that did not ask for your attention but held it completely. He was in love with her. He had been moving toward this knowledge for weeks, and now he had arrived at it with the particular clarity of a man who has been walking toward a landmark across open country and has finally reached it and can see it plainly. He was in love with Lydia Vaughn, who had arrived late to a gathering and had not left early, and who had a shelf of books and opinions about what made them worth reading, and who sat at her desk and marked papers while he built her a window, and who told him the truth about things including himself. He did not tell her this on the Thursday evening in November when he arrived at the knowledge. He was not sure what to do with it yet, and he was a man who did not act before he was sure. But he was very sure of the fact itself. The window glass arrived from Jensen's shop in Myra Pass on the 17th of November, packed in straw in a wooden crate. Wallace drove out to pick it up himself rather than waiting for the delivery, which would have taken another week. He installed it on a Saturday morning in a schoolhouse empty of children, with Lydia present again, this time with a book rather than papers to mark, sitting in the corner with the thin winter light coming through the new south window and falling across the pages in exactly the way she had described wanting it to fall. She looked up when he fitted the last pane and turned to see the light. "Oh," she said, and the single syllable had in it the quality of a person who has been given exactly the thing they wanted and is slightly surprised by the sincerity of their own pleasure. "It catches well," he agreed. She stood up and walked to the window and put her hand in the bar of pale November sunlight on the floor, the way people touch new things to make them real. He watched her do this from across the room. "Wallace," she said, still looking at the light. "Yes, I am going to say something direct." "You generally do." She turned from the window. "I like your company very much. I look forward to Thursday evenings. I think about our conversations on days that are not Thursdays. I am telling you this so you know, and not because I expect anything in return for the information, but I thought you should have it." The schoolroom was very quiet. Outside, a horse went past on the main street with the particular sound of iron shoes on cold, packed earth. The new window let in pale light that fell on the clean floor, and on Lydia Vaughn standing in it with her book under one arm, and her direct dark eyes looking at him with the steadiness she gave to everything. "I think about you on days that are not Thursdays as well," he said. "And on Thursdays I think about you before and after." He moved across the room toward her, not quickly, the way a man moves when he is certain of his direction. "I think about you every morning on the fence line." "The fence line," she said, and there was something beginning in her expression that he had not seen there before, something warmer than her usual directness. "I saw you at the Cottonwood Bend that first Monday morning," he said, "from the rise. I wondered," she said, "I thought I saw you turn back. I did not want to disturb you. You would not have disturbed me." She was looking at him with full attention. "You would not disturb me, Wallace." He was standing very close to her now, close enough to see the particular quality of that warmth in her expression, close enough to understand it exactly. "Lydia," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was a simple and honest one, unhurried, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, her free hand against his jaw, and the pale November light came through the new south window and lay across the schoolroom floor in the exact quality she had wanted for her students. And Wallace Wallace, who had been leaving early his whole life, felt with great certainty that he had arrived somewhere entirely. They stepped apart. Lydia's expression had changed in the best possible way. The steadiness was still there, but overlaid with something brilliant and warm. "Thursday," she said, as if confirming something already agreed upon. "Thursday," he said. And then, because she was Lydia, he added, "And any other day you will have me." She smiled at him, the full one, the one that changed everything, and went back to her corner with her book. He looked at the window for a moment, at the good clean work of it, at the light coming through it. Then he gathered his tools and began to pack up, and the schoolroom was warm and quiet and entirely right. December descended on Coldwater Creek with genuine ferocity. The woolly caterpillars had been accurate, as it turned out. 3 feet of snow fell in the first week, which was unusual even by the standards of the high desert, and the road to Myra Pass became difficult and then briefly impassable. The creek froze partially, leaving a narrow dark channel of moving water visible between the white edges. The cottonwood trees stood bare and silver against the sky. School continued, because Lydia Vaughn was not the kind of teacher who closed the schoolhouse because of weather, but she walked to the school with her coat fastened tight and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Wallace came into town more frequently. He told himself it was because the supply situation in winter always required more trips to Garland's store. He told himself this with the comfortable awareness that it was partially, but not entirely true. He brought Lydia a cord of firewood that she had mentioned she would need, and that she accepted with practical gratitude and an invitation to stay for supper, which had become the standard exchange between them. He helped her fix the latch on the Morrison Place's back door that had begun sticking in the cold. He sat by her fire in the evenings and read while she wrote letters to her family in Texas. And the domestic ease of this, 2 people in a warm room with their own occupations, not requiring anything from each other but glad of the other's presence, was something so natural and so good that it sometimes stopped him mid-sentence in whatever he was reading, the quality of it demanding a moment of simple recognition. "My mother asks about my situation here," Lydia said one evening, looking up from her letter, "by which she means she is asking whether I have met anyone suitable." "What will you tell her?" Wallace asked. "I am considering my answer." She tapped her pen against the paper. "She will want details. She is a woman who believes that incomplete information is a form of deception. I respect that position." "I thought you would." She looked at him across the room. "She will want to know about you, whether you are reliable." "I fix windows and supply firewood." "Those are good details." She turned back to her letter with a small and private smile that he was, at this point, collecting the way a man collects things of value. It was after Christmas, a Coldwater Creek Christmas that was modest and good, with a church service and a communal supper, and a children's pageant that Lydia had organized with the cheerful ruthlessness of a woman who has managed children professionally, and is not intimidated by the chaos that pageants require, that things moved between them into something more explicitly stated, more formally real. January 3rd, 1883. The evening had been long and pleasant, and the fire in the Morrison place was burning down to coals, and the snow outside had the deep blue quality of winter nights when the temperature is genuinely serious. Wallace was in the coat he wore over his coat for cold nights, preparing to go, and he stood in the small entryway and said what he had been building toward for 2 months. "Lydia, I want to marry you." She was standing in the kitchen doorway, still holding the coffee pot she had been about to put away, and she looked at him for a moment with the full force of her attention. "I want to be clear about what kind of marriage I mean," he continued, because he was a man who believed in saying the complete thing. "I mean the kind where you keep your position at the school if you want it. I mean the kind where you tell me when something is wrong and I tell you the same. I mean the kind where we are both full people and not not a piece of furniture that belongs to the other person's arrangement. She set the coffee pot down on the kitchen table with deliberate care. That is the most articulate definition of a good marriage I have ever heard from a man who does not work at it for a living. I have been thinking about it for some time. I can tell. She crossed the kitchen and stood before him in the entryway and put her hands on the front of his outer coat. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he repeated, wanting to be sure. "Yes, Wallace Wallace, I will marry you. Yes to all the things you said about what kind of marriage." Her eyes were bright. "And yes to the fence line and the cottonwood grove and the creek and the land and the life of it. Yes to all of it." He put his arms around her, and she came into them with the unself-conscious ease of two people who have been moving toward each other for long enough that the arrival is simply the natural conclusion of the journey. He held her for a long moment with his face against her hair and the winter dark outside the windows and the low coals in the grate. "I will call on your father," he said. "You can write him. He will appreciate the formality." She moved back enough to look at him. "He will want to know about your land and your operation. He is a practical man." "I am a practical man." "You are," she said. "You are also the man who built me a window so the light would come in right. My father does not need to know everything." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite version he produced at gatherings, and it surprised them both slightly, and she looked pleased at the surprise of it in a way that made him want to do it again. They were married on the 14th of March, 1883, which was still cold enough for coats at the church, but had the particular quality of light that comes when the season is genuinely turning, a brightness with a little warmth in it for the first time in months. Reverend Dawes performed the ceremony. The church was full. Martha Aldridge cried with the frank emotion of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the outcome and is satisfied with her work. Chet stood beside his wife and was impeccably stoic, which Martha told him later was not the correct response to a wedding. Wallace wore his good suit, which was dark and well-made, and had been worn to his father's funeral and not since. Lydia wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself with the help of Florence Garland, who was an excellent seamstress, with blue ribbon at the sleeves and collar. She walked into the church without anyone on her arm because she had no family present from Texas. The journey was too far and too costly, though her mother had written a letter of such warm and specific generosity that Wallace had read it twice. And she walked in with her head up and her face open, and that direct quality that was entirely and only her. And Wallace, standing at the front of the church watching her come toward him, felt the stone in his chest that had first settled there on a night in October dissolve entirely, replaced by something lighter and better and more permanent. He said his vows in a clear voice. She said hers in a voice that was equally clear, and that trembled just slightly on the word love, in a way that only he noticed, and that he would remember for the rest of his life. They walked out of the church into March sunlight with the whole town behind them, which was something Wallace had not anticipated, the goodwill of an entire community he had spent years mostly walking away from aimed at him all at once, and he found that he was glad to receive it. He stood in the sunlight with his wife beside him and received it. The reception was held in the livery, which had once again been swept and decorated by the Methodist Ladies' Auxiliary, and Pete Dunlap played, and there was whiskey and there were pies that Martha and Florence and 3 other women had spent 2 days preparing, and the whole of Coldwater Creek celebrated. Wallace and Lydia danced. He was not a natural dancer, a fact he had informed her of in advance, and she had told him that she would navigate for both of them, which was both a practical and a deeply accurate statement about their partnership. And they danced badly and well, and with a great deal of genuine happiness. And when the fiddler moved into a slower tune, and Wallace had his wife in his arms in the livery that smelled faintly and permanently of horse, she looked up at him and said quietly, "Are you going to leave early?" "I was not planning on it," he said. "Good," she said, and put her head against his shoulder, and they stayed until the lanterns burned low. Life on the ranch settled into a new form, which was the same in its essential structure but entirely different in everything that mattered. Lydia moved to the ranch in the week following the wedding, bringing her books, her writing desk, her pots, and the practical organization of a woman who has lived alone and knows exactly how she wants things arranged. The Morrison place was released back to its owner, a land speculator in Santa Fe who was never there. The ranch house, which Wallace had always kept clean out of habit but had never decorated or arranged beyond functional necessity, became a home in the way that a house becomes a home when there is someone in it who is thinking about what makes a life good rather than merely what makes a structure functional. She hung curtains she made herself. She found, in Myra Pass on one of their joint supply trips, a rag rug in deep reds and blues that she put in front of the fireplace. She organized the kitchen with an efficiency that initially displaced several of Wallace's systems, which he mentioned once and then, understanding that her system was better, did not mention again. She put her books on a new shelf he built for her in the corner of the main room, and she added to his 2 books on cattle management a considerable collection of novels and histories, and a worn copy of a book about the birds of the Southwest that she told him had been her father's, and was the only thing he had given her that she had brought all the way from Texas. He showed her the land. He rode her through every part of it, naming each section, explaining its history, its particular qualities, its challenges. She listened the way she always listened, with full presence, asking questions that showed she had actually processed what he had said and was building on it. By April she knew the fence line's trouble spots and the winter pasture's condition, and the names and dispositions of every animal in the herd, as well as most neighbors who had made a career out of avoiding social interaction, could reasonably be expected to. She rode well, which she had told him at some point, and which he had not doubted, and she sat a horse with the same unself-conscious ease as everything else she did. The spring brought its work in a flood, the way spring always did after a hard winter. Wallace was out before dawn most days, and Lydia rode to the school each morning on the steady mare she now kept in their small stable, and the work of 2 lives ran alongside each other like parallel streams, different and the same. They had their evenings, which were now every evening rather than Thursdays only, and sometimes Lydia fell asleep over her papers, and Wallace would take the papers gently from her hands, and she would wake enough to look at him in a way that made the whole long day worth the length of it. He loved her work the way you love a thing that is not yours, but that you recognize as good. He watched her walk into that schoolhouse every morning with the same focused purpose that he brought to the land, the sense of a person who takes seriously the thing they have been given to do, and it seemed to him one of the finest things he knew about her, which was a long list. April brought news. There had been conflict on the eastern side of the territory between certain Anglo ranchers and the Mexican landowners, who had held their grants for generations. The kind of conflict that Wallace had watched from a distance, with the particular discomfort of a man who understands injustice and has the luxury of being insulated from it. The Grant County War, as people were calling it, was not Coldwater Creek's immediate trouble, but its reach was long, and several families in the territory who had held land legitimately under their old land grants were losing it through combinations of legal manipulation and intimidation that were, in Wallace's view, straightforwardly wrong regardless of how they were framed legally. He talked with Lydia about this on a spring evening with the windows open and the first real warmth of the season coming in with the smell of creek water and new grass. "There is a family called the Rays," he said. "They have land south of here, about 50 acres on good water. They have been there since before New Mexico was a territory of the United States. Their grandfather held the Spanish land grant. There is a man from the east called Harmon who has been pressing them on the boundaries, bringing a surveyor out with numbers that do not match the original documents." "What can be done?" Lydia asked. "They need someone to speak for them at the county seat, a man of sufficient local standing to make the case that the boundaries in the original grant are correct. Harmon is counting on the family not being able to navigate the legal channels," "Are you the man of sufficient local standing?" Lydia asked. "Sheriff Cole thinks so. He asked me last week." "Then you should go." He looked at her. "It will take 3 days, maybe 4. Wallace," she said, with a patient affection that was becoming one of his most treasured experiences, "I lived alone in this territory for 6 weeks before I met you. I am capable of managing the ranch for 4 days. Chet will be here. I know Chet will be here. Go and speak for the Ray's family." He went. He spent 4 days at the county seat with the documents and with Sheriff Cole, and with a lawyer named Ortega who had been working the case for the Ray's family and who was sharp and thorough, and who needed, as he explained to Wallace, a prominent Anglo rancher on record supporting the claim, because the political reality of the territory was exactly as ugly as Wallace had suspected. The hearing went well. The original grant was upheld. The Harmon claim was dismissed. It was not a dramatic victory, it was a bureaucratic one, fought with documents and testimony rather than firearms, but it was real and it was right. When Wallace returned to the ranch on the 4th day, Lydia was on the porch in the evening light with a cup of coffee, and she stood when she saw his wagon coming up the road and came down the steps to meet him. "Well," she said, "the Ray's family keeps their land," he said. She put both arms around him right there in the yard, with the horses watching and the evening light slanting gold across everything. "Good," she said into his shoulder. "That is good, Wallace." He held her in the yard for a long moment and breathed the smell of her hair and the smell of the land and the smell of the evening, all of it together, all of it his. And the word, home, became not just the house behind her, but the whole of it. The woman in his arms and the land around them and the life they were building from honest work and honest feeling. By July of 1883, Lydia told him with a directness that was entirely consistent with everything else about her that they were going to have a child. He sat very still for a moment at the kitchen table where she had told him, and then he said, "When?" "March, I think. Perhaps February if I am off by a little." He looked at her face, which was watching him with a watchfulness he recognized. She wanted to know how he felt without asking him to perform feeling he did not have. He thought about his father who had taught him things about work and land and continuance by example and without words. He thought about the land under his feet and the creek beyond it and the cottonwood trees where Lydia walked in the mornings. "I am glad," he said. "More than I know how to say right now, but I am deeply glad." She smiled at him, and he stood up from the table and came around it and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that surprised them both, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth. "March," he said. "Or February," she said. "Whichever month is ready first." She laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the summer land hummed with heat and grasshoppers and the perpetual industry of the West. Lydia continued teaching through the summer and into the fall. She told the school board in August, simply and without excessive explanation, that she intended to continue teaching through the school year and that arrangements could be made as necessary when the time came. Reverend Dawes, who was a fundamentally decent man, agreed. Some members of the Ladies' Auxiliary had opinions on the propriety of a visibly expectant woman teaching school, and Martha Aldridge, who had opinions of her own about women with opinions, handled this situation with the same brisk efficiency she applied to everything. The autumn gathering of 1883, 1 year from the night everything had begun, was held again at the Livery in the 3rd week of October. Wallace had not missed a Thursday supper, a church social, or a community event since the previous harvest gathering, a fact that Chet mentioned to him in mid-October with the brevity and satisfaction of a man who has witnessed a significant change and does not need to editorialize about it. "You have not left early from anything in a year," Chet said, checking the condition of the winter fence posts with his usual thorough grimness. "I have noticed," Wallace said. "Martha has also noticed. She feels it reflects well on her." "Does she?" She told Lydia it was her finest matchmaking achievement in 20 years of trying, even though Lydia points out that Martha did not exactly manage the whole thing. She managed the introduction. "She has taken full credit for it," Chet said. And I have told her that is fair because she did in 10 seconds what you might have taken another 10 years to do on your own. Wallace considered this with the honesty it deserved. That is probably accurate. I know it is. The harvest gathering of 1883 was everything the previous years had been, and Lydia Vaughn Wallace arrived at 7 o'clock this time, walking through the livery doors with the ease of a woman who has been part of this community for a year and knows every person in the room by name. She was visibly expecting by this point, 5 months along, and she moved through the room with the particular focused grace of a woman who has decided that the state of her body is interesting rather than inconvenient. She wore a deep blue dress, and her hair was up, and she was, to Wallace standing near the wall in his usual position, the finest thing in the room. He crossed the room immediately. This was no longer the act of a man who does not cross rooms. He had become, gradually and entirely, a man who crosses rooms for this woman, a transformation that had happened so naturally that he had barely noticed it becoming true. "You are on time," he said. "I made an effort," she said, taking his arm. "Last year you arrived at 9:30. Last year I was making venison stew and proportions and excuses." She looked up at him with a brightness that this year had the warmth of everything that had happened between that October and this one layered into it. "This year, I had a reason to be on time." They stayed until the lanterns burned low. They danced, badly and well, Pete Dunlap playing with his ancient authority and Thomas the guitar player having considerably improved over the year. They talked with the Ray's family, who had come up from their land south of town to attend, and who greeted Wallace with the particular warmth of people who have been treated with fairness by someone who had no personal obligation to provide it. They ate Florence Garland's excellent pie, and talked with Sheriff Cole about the winter road, and with Dr. Prout about what to expect in February or March, who was knowledgeable and reassuring, and only mildly alarmed by Lydia's declaration that she intended to return to teaching 6 weeks after the birth. Driving home under the October stars, Lydia beside him on the wagon seat with a blanket across her lap and her shoulder against his, Wallace felt the fullness of the year behind them and the year ahead with a clarity that was almost painful in its goodness. "Wallace," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" He turned to look at her in the starlight. "I am extremely happy," he said, with the directness that he had learned from her, the willingness to state the complete true thing without flinching from its size. "I am happier than I knew how to want to be a year ago." She took his hand from the reins and held it in both of hers on the blanket. "So am I," she said. They rode home in the dark with the creek running somewhere to their east, winter coming but not yet here, the stars very clear and very many above the high desert country of New Mexico territory. Their son was born on the 21st of February, 1884. Dr. Prout came out to the ranch well before dawn when Lydia had decided the situation required professional presence, which was a decision she made with characteristic practical judgment and not the slightest drama. Martha Aldridge came as well, because she was the most experienced woman in Coldwater Creek in these matters, and because nothing would have kept her away. The birth was difficult in the way that first births are often difficult, long and exhausting in the hours before dawn, with the winter cold pressing against the walls of the ranch house, and Wallace stayed in the kitchen with Chet, who had come out of a vague sense that his presence was necessary, and was now sitting at the table with the expression of a man who has been through this several times with his own children, and knows that the available options are waiting and coffee. The baby came just after first light. Dr. Prout opened the bedroom door and looked at Wallace with the expression of a man who has just done something important and is genuinely pleased by the outcome. "A son," he said, "healthy. Lydia is tired but well." Wallace went in. Lydia was in the bed, considerably tired and entirely herself, holding the baby with the particular focused attention she gave to new things, and the baby was small and red and surprisingly loud about being in the world. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, his wife and his son. The room was full of the early morning light that came through good windows. He had put good windows in the ranch house the previous fall, and the light lay across Lydia's tired face and the baby's round, an opinionated one with an equal gentleness. "Hello," Lydia said to the baby, in the same tone she used for everything she was genuinely interested in. Then she looked at Wallace. "Come and see him." He put his arm around her and looked at their son and felt something that was not like anything he had felt before, a love that was bigger than he had understood love could be, big enough to contain fear and gladness and the whole weight of responsibility and the whole lightness of pure, uncomplicated wonder all at the same time. "What do we call him?" Lydia said they had discussed this. They had discussed it at considerable length on several Thursday evenings before Thursday evenings became every evening, and they had arrived at the same answer from slightly different directions which had satisfied them both. "Henry," Wallace said. "Henry Vaughn Wallace." "Henry Vaughn Wallace," she repeated, looking at the baby with that look. "That is a name he can use in any room he walks into. His father's name has not served that purpose, admittedly." "His father's name," Lydia said, with the warmth that was specifically for him, "has served every purpose I have required of it." He stayed at her side for the whole of that day, which was not something he had ever needed to decide to do. It was simply where he was, where he wanted to be, where everything was on the 21st of February, 1884, with the winter outside and the light inside and his wife resting with their son in the ranch house on land that was now, more fully than it had ever been, a home. Henry Vaughn Wallace grew in the way that children grow in the West, fast and sun-browned and curious. He walked at 11 months, which surprised no one who knew his mother. He talked at 13 months in full sentences with opinions, which surprised no one either. He had Lydia's eyes, dark and direct, and Wallace's steadiness, and a combination of his parents' stubbornness that produced, in practice, a child who thought things through with alarming thoroughness, and then did exactly as he had planned regardless of any evidence that a different approach might be available. Lydia returned to teaching 6 weeks after Henry was born, as promised, with Henry in a cradle in the corner of the schoolroom that the older children competed for the privilege of rocking during reading hour. This arrangement, which scandalized approximately 4 people in Coldwater Creek and was thought perfectly sensible by everyone else, continued through the spring term. By summer, Henry was sufficiently mobile that the cradle became impractical, and Lydia shifted to teaching the summer term only, with Florence Garland's daughter, a capable girl of 19 named Ruth, minding Henry at the Morrison place during school hours. The years that followed had the quality of good land, productive and not always easy, with hard seasons and good ones, with the particular texture of a life that has found its right form and is developing within it. In the summer of 1885, there was a prolonged drought that took the creek down to its lowest in living memory and stressed the herd considerably. Wallace made the decisions that needed to be made, reduced the herd by selling a portion early, moved the cattle to the northern pasture, where a spring kept the grass alive longer, spent 2 months doing the hard, unglamorous work of managing scarce water across a large property. Lydia kept the school going through a summer that was brutal in its heat, and helped organize a community water-sharing arrangement with 3 neighboring properties that proved effective enough that Sheriff Cole wrote it up and sent it to the territorial capital as a model. "You are the most practical person I know," Wallace told her one evening at the end of that dry summer, when the first real rain in months had finally come and they were sitting on the porch watching it fall. "You say that with admiration," she said. "I say it with complete admiration." She looked at the rain. "My grandmother used to say that practical is just another word for paying attention to what is actually there rather than what you wish were there. Your grandmother was very wise." She was. "I have been thinking about her lately." She turned to look at him in the damp dusk air. "I have been thinking that I would like Henry to know her." He looked at her, understanding what she was saying. "A trip to Texas. In the spring, when the roads are better. She is 73. I do not want to wait much longer." "We will go in the spring," he said. They went in April of 1886, the three of them in the wagon, a journey of 4 days each way. Lydia's grandmother, a woman of 74 who was small and brown and sharp-eyed, and who had the same quality of full attention as her granddaughter. The source, suddenly obvious, sat on her porch in the hill country and looked at Henry for a long moment when he was brought to her. And Henry looked back with his honest dark eyes. And the old woman said something to Lydia in Spanish that made Lydia laugh out loud with a fullness that Wallace had rarely heard. "She says he has the look of someone who will be stubborn about the right things," Lydia told him. "That is accurate," Wallace said. He spent the days of the visit talking with Lydia's father, who was indeed a practical man with a hardware store and an exacting approach to wood grades and iron fittings, and who assessed Wallace with the slow thoroughness of a man who has been thinking about this assessment for 3 years and is finally in a position to make it in person. On the last evening, Lydia's father said simply that he was glad his daughter had found someone who knew what was worth holding onto. "So am I," Wallace said. Lydia's grandmother pressed a small painted ceramic tile into Wallace's hand as they were leaving a desert scene with a creek and 2 cottonwood trees, hand-painted in the old style, the colors bright and specific. "She painted it herself," Lydia said, looking at it over his shoulder. "When? After I wrote to her about the cottonwood grove where I used to walk." Lydia looked up at him. "After I wrote to her about you." He put the tile carefully in the front pocket of his coat, against his heart, and drove them home. The tile sat on the mantel in the ranch house for the rest of their lives, between Lydia's father's bird book and the photograph taken at their wedding by a traveling photographer who had come through Coldwater Creek in 1883, in which Wallace looked formal and slightly bewildered, and Lydia looked directly and happily at the camera with her hand on Wallace's arm. In the autumn of 1886, Lydia told him they would have another child. This one came in May of 1887, easier than the first, in the full brightness of a late spring morning with the windows open, and the smell of new grass coming in and Pete Dunlap's fiddling carrying faintly from somewhere in town, because there was a dance that evening. A girl this time, round and serious, born into a house that already knew how to receive a new person. "Margaret," Lydia said, when they had sat together long enough for the decision to be clear. "Margaret Esther Wallace, after your mother." Wallace had not suggested his mother's name. He had been carrying it quietly, the way he carried most things that mattered to him, without announcement. Lydia had, in the course of their years together, learned to read what he carried quietly, and she was now, more often than not, the one who named it for him. "Yes," he said, the one syllable carrying everything. Henry, at 3 years old, examined his sister with the same careful assessment he brought to all new things in the world, and then declared her satisfactory, which made Lydia laugh again in that full way. The children grew up on the land, knowing every section of it the way children know a place when they are given the freedom to know it fully. Henry learned cattle work young, riding with Wallace and Chet from the time he could sit a horse independently, and he brought to it the same focused intelligence he brought to everything else, asking questions that were frequently better than the answers Wallace had immediately available. Margaret was quieter than her brother in the first years, and then, when she decided to talk, talked in the measured full sentences of a person who has been listening carefully and is now ready to contribute, which made Wallace look at Lydia whenever it happened with a recognition that was also pure happiness. Chet Aldridge retired in the spring of 1889, at 68 years old, with the announcement that his back was done with fence posts, and that Martha had been telling him this for 2 years, and she was right. Wallace spent the retirement party, which was held at the ranch, a decision Chet had made on the grounds that the livery was always slightly cold, in the particular warmth of a man surrounded by the life he had built. Martha was there, and Florence and Roy Garland and Sheriff Cole, and the Ray's family, who had become friends in the years since the hearing, and Pete Dunlap, who played even though it was not officially a musical event, because Pete Dunlap played at any gathering of more than 4 people regardless of invitation. Chet, slightly drunk on the good whiskey Wallace had brought out for the occasion, pulled Wallace aside near the end of the evening. "You were the most difficult man I ever worked for," Chet said. "Not because of your temper, which you have never had, or your unfairness, which does not exist, but because you were always leaving before anything got interesting, and a man who leaves before anything gets interesting is a man you cannot get a handle on." "I stopped leaving," Wallace said. "You stopped leaving," Chet agreed. He looked across the room to where Lydia was talking with Martha, Henry on her hip even though he was 5 and too old for it, but had fallen asleep against her shoulder, Margaret in her arms on the other side, and the lantern light making everything warm and specific. "She arrived late, and you did not go. That is the best thing that ever happened to this ranch." "It is the best thing that ever happened to me," Wallace said. Chet looked at him for a moment with 68 years of direct human assessment and then said, "I know," and went to find his wife. Wallace had hired a new foreman the previous month, a man named Samuel Bright who was 42 and had 20 years of ranching experience and an honest face. Samuel was proving competent and steady, which was what the ranch needed, and the transition of knowledge from Chet to Samuel was going well, which Wallace had overseen with the thoroughness it required. By 1890, the ranch had grown. Wallace had purchased an additional 300 acres to the north when the Fitch family moved on, bringing the total to 1,500 acres with a better water situation. The herd was healthy. The house had been expanded 2 additional rooms, properly framed and windowed, built by Wallace over the course of 2 summers, to accommodate a family of 4 comfortably. The school had a new teacher, a young woman from Colorado named Agnes Park, after Lydia had handed the position over with a thoroughness and generosity of training that Agnes later described, to anyone who asked, as the best professional preparation she had ever received. Lydia did not stop working. She began teaching adults, a reading and writing program, 2 evenings a week in the schoolhouse, that drew the ranch hands and several of the newer arrivals to the territory who had not had the opportunity for formal schooling. She organized the program herself, drew up the curriculum, sourced the books through a contact at the university in Albuquerque. Wallace attended the first session to see how it was set up, sat in the back, watched his wife teach a room full of grown men and women the letters they had not had access to with the same clear-eyed patience and genuine respect she brought to 7-year-olds learning to read, and felt the full magnitude of his love for her like weather, like altitude, like the thing itself. He told her this on the walk home that first evening under the stars of Coldwater Creek, Henry and Margaret asleep at home with the hired girl watching. "You were in the back of the room," she said. "I wanted to see. You have seen me teach for 7 years. I wanted to see this, the adult program. The way you talk to them is different." She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. It is different. They are people who have been told for a long time that they are past the learning age or that they do not deserve the education, and the first thing they need is to understand that neither thing is true. "How do you do that in the first session?" "I ask them what they already know," she said. "Everyone knows something. When you start from what people know, you are telling them that what they know has value. That is the beginning." He walked beside her in the night with the creek audible somewhere to their left, running high this year after a good spring, the cottonwood trees that he could not see but knew were there, the land that was his and now theirs and someday Henry's, and the woman beside him in the cool night air with her boots making a clean sound on the road. "Lydia," he said. "Yes. I love you considerably." She laughed, the full one, the real one, the one that had been entirely worth every fence post and window frame and early morning ride. "I love you considerably as well, Wallace Wallace," she said, and took his arm and they walked home. The 1890s brought changes to the territory. The railroad had come to the southern portions, and Coldwater Creek, being somewhat off the main line, remained its own particular self. A town that knew what it was, that had its church and its school and its saloons and its community of people who had built something on difficult land and intended to keep building. Wallace watched the changes with the attentiveness of a man who has learned to pay attention to everything that might affect his land and his people, and he navigated them with the practicality that he had brought to everything since the age of 12, when he had watched his father get up after a drought and simply start again. Henry turned 12 in 1896 and began working the ranch in earnest, with a seriousness and competence that made Samuel Bright, now a fixture of the operation, occasionally look at Wallace as if to say, "Do you see this?" And Wallace would nod. Because he saw it, and it was the same quality of proud feeling that he had felt when Henry first walked, and when Henry first read a complete page of print, and when Henry first made a decision on the ranch that turned out to be better than the one Wallace would have made. Margaret at 9 was reading at a level that Lydia described as extraordinary, and that Agnes Park, the school teacher, confirmed with the enthusiasm of a teacher who is given a student who wants the work. She had an interest in drawing detailed observational drawings of plants and animals and the particular geography of the land that she had been producing since she was 5 in the back pages of whatever books she could get paper from. Lydia had sent several of these drawings to a contact in Albuquerque and received back a serious letter about their quality. "She draws the way you see land," Lydia said to Wallace, looking at one of Margaret's drawings of the cottonwood bend at the creek, done with a pencil in careful, considered lines. "She draws the way you pay attention," he said. Lydia looked at the drawing and then at him. "We have made very good people," she said. "We have," he agreed. The harvest gathering of 1895, 13 years from the night in the livery, with the lanterns and Pete Dunlap, and the woman who arrived when the moon was already high, was attended by Wallace and Lydia together, as every gathering in Coldwater Creek had been attended for 13 years, arriving at a reasonable hour and staying until the end. Pete Dunlap was now 83 years old and played only 3 songs per gathering, on doctor's orders, but those 3 songs were played with the full authority of 83 years of music, and the audience listened to them accordingly. Henry was there at 11, standing with his parents with the height he was beginning to develop, already promising the substantial frame he would grow into. Margaret was at Lydia's side with her characteristic quiet observation, taking everything in. Wallace stood in the livery that smelled of horse and saw Lydia talking with Florence Garland and Martha Aldridge, who was 70 now and had lost none of her forthright energy, and he thought of the first time he had seen her cross this room with a covered dish in both hands, late and alone and entirely herself. He thought about the hat in his hand, and about not going, the decision that was not quite a decision, the way staying had felt like the most natural thing and the most significant at the same time. He thought about the window in the morning light, about the supper table, about the creek, about a year of Thursday evenings and everything that had grown from them. He crossed the room to where she was. She saw him coming and said to Florence and Martha, "Excuse me one moment," and turned to him with the full attention she had always given him, that had never reduced in 13 years of mornings and evenings and seasons. That was simply what her attention was, complete, clear, genuinely present. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you?" "I was going to say something," he said, "but I cannot currently find the words for it." She looked at him with the expression that was specifically his, that had been accumulating since October of 1882 and now contained everything. "You do not need words for it," she said. "I know what it is." "I know you do," he said. She took his arm. They stood together in the livery in the warm light with their children nearby and their friends around them, and the music starting up again, Pete Dunlap deciding to play a 4th song regardless of Dr. Pruitt's opinion, and the whole of Coldwater Creek gathered for the harvest in the year 1895. Wallace Wallace, who had for years been the first to leave every gathering in this town, had become the man who arrived with his wife and stayed until the last light. He had become this man the way a river becomes its course, through the particular pressure of water and stone and time, through the specific and unrepeatable geography of one person finding another in a room and not leaving, through Lydia Vaughn arriving late to a harvest gathering in October of 1882, and a man who had been leaving early his whole life looking at the door and deciding, for the first time, that he had no reason to go. He had, as it turned out, every reason to stay. They stayed that night until Pete Dunlap played his last note and folded his fiddle into its case for what he said was absolutely the final time this evening, and was not believed by anyone. They stayed while Henry fell asleep upright against a hay bale and had to be gently prodded awake by his sister. They stayed while the lanterns burned to their lowest, and the couples and families of Coldwater Creek moved out into the October night in their clusters of warmth and noise, and they walked out last into the cool air with their children beside them, and the stars above the high desert country of New Mexico Territory vast and particular and clear. Wallace put Henry and Margaret in the wagon, and Lydia climbed up to the seat beside him, and he took the reins, and the horse moved forward into the dark road, and the creek was somewhere to the east, and the cottonwood trees were there invisible in the dark but known, entirely known, every stone and bend of the land known, the way a man knows a thing when he has given his whole life to knowing it. "Cold," Lydia said, pulling her coat closer. He shifted the reins to one hand and put his other arm around her, and she leaned into his side with the ease of 13 years, and the wagon moved along the road toward home. Behind them, the livery lanterns went dark one by one. Ahead of them, the ranch house was waiting with the fire in the grate that he had banked before they left, warm by now, the rooms they had made together with their hands and their years and their attention to each other. The tile on the mantel between the bird book and the wedding photograph, the shelf of books, the good windows letting in whatever light the morning would bring. Henry fell asleep in the wagon bed. Margaret watched the stars from beside her brother with her quiet, observant eyes, memorizing, the way she memorized everything, the particular quality of this night, the cold, the dark, her parents' voices low and steady ahead of her, the horses' footfalls on the road, the creek sound, the cottonwoods. Wallace drove them home under the stars of New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1895, with his wife against his side and his children asleep and the land that he loved all around him and the whole of his life, the whole earned and tended and beloved whole of it, entire. He had not left early. He had not left at all. He had arrived at the only place that had ever been worth arriving at, and he intended, with everything he had, to stay.